This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. A huge thanks goes out to John O'Neill and Sarah Wynne, authors of the book The Dancer and the Devil, Stalin, Pavlova, and the Road to the Great Pandemic. You can learn more about Sarah and John and their book at danceranddevil.com or in the show notes. Some of what you hear today in today's episode could be labeled as a little controversial. I don't agree with everything the authors said, and I don't disagree with everything they said. I appreciate their willingness to share their point of view with me and you. I would love to hear what you think about this episode and any other episode you feel strongly about. You can now support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon by going over to Patreon. You help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go over to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. Special thanks goes out to Alex at the executive producer level on Patreon. Another way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History, can be found in the show notes. And of course, you can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, how to contact me and support the show by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. I thank you for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen. Thank you so much for joining us on Beyond the Big Screen. I am really happy to be joined today by authors John O'Neill and Sarah Wynne to talk about Stalin, pandemics, and history of the 20th century through their book, The Dancer and the Devil, Stalin, Pavlova, and the Road to the Great Pandemic. Now, before we get started, can you maybe give us the 10,000 foot view of this book, because there's several moving pieces going on in the book.
Stalin inspired the book in a strange way, the world's most evil man. Stalin, at the 1943 Tehran conference, proposed killing 10 million Germans. And Winston Churchill said, "We can't kill 1 million Germans. We're Christians. We believe in God." And Stalin said, "God may be a conservative, but the devil is a good communist." He said, "We can kill 1 million people and it will be only a statistic. It's when we kill one person and people learn about it that it becomes a tragedy." And so the idea behind the book was to take actual specimen cases of murder by Stalin and bring those forward. In the course of writing, we learned a great deal more. To give you an overview, what we came to learn is that in 1921, Stalin started a poison lab in the Soviet Union to wipe out people that he couldn't shoot publicly. People like dancers and writers and political officials. And he wiped them out using history's first bioweapons, anthrax and other weapons. And they expanded into huge biolabs that he had to actually develop bioweapons to use. He never used those, the bioweapons on a large scale, but these expanded in the entire Soviet period into what was called Project Enzyme, and they expanded into China. And so China and Russia have huge bioweapons facilities. The pandemic we refer to is, of course, the leak of COVID-19 out of the China bioweapons facility located in Wuhan, China, one of 14 bioweapons facilities that China currently has. And so the book traces the ideology of Stalinism, which is contempt for human life and contempt for human beings, and a demand to absolutely control all culture and all knowledge and all books. And it's accompanying poisons and bioweapons that have accompanied it all through history, into Putin and into Xi, two disciples of Stalin.
It's interesting. A lot of the book focuses around themes around the Russian ballet and the ballet Russes. What was the ballet situation in Soviet Well, maybe, yeah, let's talk about it, the ballet situation during early Soviet times.
Well, it's interesting. Of course, there's something in the Russian soul that loves music, and Tchaikovsky and so many great composers are Russian, and so much of the ballet comes from Russia. Swan Lake, the Nutcracker. Think of at least half of the great ballets are all Russian ballets, and the great ballerinas. And in the greatest of all ballets was the great Imperial Ballet that operated at the Mironovsky Theater in St. Petersburg. It was created by a man named Marius Petita. In 1904, Petita, an aged man, is looking, and all of a sudden a little girl appears in front of Petita and says that she was every ballet master's dream. And that was Anna Pavlova, the greatest of all ballet dancers, who was frail, but who could express incredible emotion in her dance. She became famous in 1904 at the Imperial Ball, as we described. Much later, she danced a dance that was called the Dying Swan, that is the most famous of all ballet vignettes. She happened to be out of Russia when the Bolsheviks took control. There was some thought of abolishing ballet, but Stalin was consumed with ballet. He loved ballet. And he thought that he could turn ballet to a weapon of the Soviet cause. And so he had an actual seat like Nero at the Colosseum that overlooked the dancers. And if you produced the wrong ballets, as happened in 1924, some of the imperial ballets, you just disappeared and were put in an insane asylum, or you were shot. If you produced the right ballets, which is workmen banging on hammers to make the music, and Spartacus, an incredibly stupid ballet of the Soviet period, then you were a great hero in Russia. His problem was that the whole world thought his ballets were crazy. The great ballets of the world remained Anna Pavlova and the Ballet Russe, run by a guy named Diaghilev, both of whom are foundational to ballet even today. One danced conventional ballets, and Diaghilev did very unconventional ballets. The Rite of Spring, Parade, just amazing ballets that featured things that had never been seen before in music. There were huge productions like Phantom of the Opera that combined all sorts of media. They had Picasso doing the background, and Chanel did the costume. And so he had one great person after another. Well, Stalin couldn't tolerate this. He told both of them to come home in the 1930s, and they wouldn't come. The first one to die was Diaghilev. And then finally in 1931, Pavlova refusing to come home and refusing her friends' entreaties to go to Hollywood and make movies and not get involved, insisted on doing a tour that would take her right to the boundary of Poland. She left the Ritz Hotel after eating lunch and climbed on a train and immediately told everyone, "I've been poisoned in Paris. I was poisoned." And she slowly died. She died, we now know, of anthrax poisoning. And as she was dying, she called for her costume. She got her friends to promise that they would go forward with the dance in her absence. And indeed, the very next night, they went forward in front of the King, Queen of England, and the King, Queen of Belgium with her. And where she was supposed to dance, they would shine a spotlight on the spots where she was supposed to dance, because they said there was no one in the world who could be an understudy to Pavlova. The following year, Stephen, they made the movie that won the Oscar as Best Movie of the Year. It was called The Grand Hotel. It was based loosely on the life of Anna Pavlova, and it left her death mysterious because no one knew how she had died. Many years later, Stalin's poisoning ring in Paris became known, and that's when people actually realized. Of course, Stalin believed you had to totally control history. He said, "He who controls the present controls the past," meaning that you could change history to be whatever you wanted it to be. He said that he would eliminate the word God in Russia by 1935. He wiped out all the Ukrainian musicians, the so-called kobars, and all their instruments, made it a death penalty offense to sing their songs in the Ukraine. And so it was total control over the mind of man. And a big part of which, in his mind, was controlling completely ballet.
It's really interesting because... And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Russia was such a creator of art and music and literature before the Soviets. And I wonder, what did the Soviets take from that rich Russian literary and culture, literary music culture? Did they modify it? Did they try to destroy it? What did they do with that treasure that they were handed?
In the Stalin period, they tried to destroy it. Subsequent to Stalin, they actually reverted back to, once again, showing the great imperial ballets, all the famous ballets, and produced some other ballets and some great ballerinas and dancers. It's interesting right now, since Putin invaded the Ukraine, the entire ballet troupe, the Mariinsky, and a lot of the ballerinas from the Bolshoi have all left Russia and come to the West, saying that he has betrayed Russian culture. We say the swans have flown. They called Anna Pavlova the Swan. And so when these people all leave, it's like the swans dispersing. But it still is very much the heart of Russia. The ballet is the Mariinsky, where Pavlova dance was restored. They even put back in the Tsar's box. And only in the Putin period did they go back to have they regressed back to a Stalinist type mentality. They're now showing at the Mariinsky Spartacus, which is a Stalinist era ballet. If you want to dance at the Mariinsky today, you've got to dance all the old Soviet stupid ballets, and that's why people are leaving.
We're often asked about why would Stalin go after ballerinas? Why would that be a threat to him? And it pertained to his doctrine of cultural hegemony. He wanted control over everyone, including the mind of man, and that included controlling the arts and dance and theater. So independent characters like Pavlova, that were more of the imperial ballet decade, were a huge threat to him.
Well, Pavlova's dance, the death of a swan, the dying swan, is a death really about the line between life and death. It's a dance about, if you can imagine, based on the Greek legend that a swan in its last moments of life can finally speak. And so the song mimics a swan in its last 3 or 4 minutes of life. And it has profound religious and other significance. If you're a non-believer, it is a dance of great tragedy, because here's this magnificent creature dying. If you're a believer, it's a dance of resurrection. And so here's this woman, Pavlova, dancing all over the world, dancing the dying swan, flying free everywhere, in the headlines everywhere. Stalin couldn't afford that, not when he was running a slave nation in Russia. And that's why he had to kill her.
You can find it today, even, Stephen. We opened our book launch with her dancing the dying swan. It's a black and white grainy footage, but it's incredibly powerful and beautiful. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you find it.
And 3 months ago, all over the world, roughly 3 months ago, ballerinas all over the world did exactly that. They danced simultaneously in locations all over the world, the dying swan, in relief of COVID and to commemorate Pavlova. So she lives a lot longer than the tyrant Stalin.
Reading your book, and I've really wondered, you get into some of where Stalin came from. He wasn't born a brute. He had a reasonable education. He had care. There was people who, he didn't have an ideal childhood, an idyllic one by any stretch of the imagination. But was there anything you saw in his upbringing or maybe his young adulthood that would give any clue that he would become, basically the monster that he would flower into?
His father was a horrific alcoholic who beat him all the time. And no matter what Stalin did, it was bad, and he got beaten up. His mother was an angelic woman who had great hopes that he'd be a priest. She even got him into the seminary. Once he was in the seminary, sadly, for a while he was okay, but after a short time, he really adopted Marxism as his religion, and he began the descent down into the monster that he became. He was kicked out of the seminary after trying to claim. What he did was plant Marxist literature in other people's deals and claim that they were Marxist. Not a very nice thing to do. He married a wonderful woman named Kiki. She was great. She died young. And I've always thought that if she hadn't, she might have turned him around. They wouldn't let her be buried in an Orthodox cemetery. And from that, he got an even more horrific hatred of religion. He hated religion. He hated the idea of God. If he wasn't devil inspired, he was certainly demonic in all ways. He killed maybe 125,000 priests in the 2-year period, 1926 to 28 in Russia.
He said with Kiki's death, his wife's death, he lost all care for humankind. It was a turning point in his life.
He would actually laugh. His friends, of course, one by one, he eliminated. And at his birthday parties, they would reenact the death of his friends. And he would laugh and laugh as if it were a big joke. I can't imagine that happening, honestly, Stephen.
No, it really is. It's absolutely unbelievable. Maybe we can talk about some of the deaths of these people like Pavlova and Diaghilev and even Lenin. You have a new idea about how Lenin was, that maybe he just didn't die at 50, what was it, 53? He was pretty young. What have you discovered about these deaths?
Well, what happened is, beginning with Lenin's secretary was a guy named Suvorov, and Suvorov died mysteriously. Suvorov hated Stalin because they had been prisoners together, and Suvorov had named his Stalin had named his dog Suvorov, and Stalin apparently was a pig in his personal habits, and so Suvorov hated him and was a tremendous obstacle to Stalin. The first thing that happened is Suvorov died mysteriously, the very same ailment that Anna Pavlova had, or developed lung problems and then died. Lenin was shot in 1919, and Lenin recovered from his wounds. And by 1922, Lenin was in pretty good shape. He called his wife in, and he gave her what's called Lenin's final testament. And he said, I'm going to read this to the Soviet Party Congress in 1923. And in it, he said, get rid of Stalin. Stalin is a dictator, a tyrant. He's not part of a party of the people. And so on the day before he was supposed to read it, after having gone hunting earlier in the day, he went home and suddenly he developed strokes, a series of strokes, and then died quickly. The death was very convenient. A pathology conference at the University of Maryland concluded he could not possibly, his prior ailments didn't account at all for his strokes, and that it was likely Stalin had poisoned him. We don't have the pathology from what actually happened, so we can't prove it. But it was certainly a very suspicious death. Many of the other deaths, like the murder of Szynski was the head of the KGB, brutal, vicious man. He was poisoned to death by Stalin in 1925. He had no heart ailments of any kind. First, his cook died of a heart attack. Then he died suddenly of a heart attack almost on the following day. There were a whole sequence of deaths, one after another. Stalin had started a lab called Lab 1, and he had a group of murderers called the Yasha Gang. The Yasha Gang murdered people all over the world, both inside Russia and outside Russia. And the book gives you the names of the people in the Yasha Gang. In Russia, they had a KGB Hall of Fame, and they still do. It's just shut down now. And at the very front of it, they have a list of the 10 greatest KGB agents of all time. I use the term KGB. It was actually NKVD early on. And 4 of them were in the Yasha Gang, 4 of the 10 people. And they were poisoners for Stalin. Putin said that Yasha recently, in 2017, Yasha was the greatest of all Soviet agents of all time. This is Yasha the poisoner, which tells you something about Putin.
They were operating largely out of Paris. And when Pavlova was poisoned, as John mentioned earlier, she got on the train and said to go to The Hague and said, I've been poisoned by the food I ate in Paris. Well, it would be another 60 plus years before the Yasha Gang was known. And so they treated her for several ailments, treated her symptoms, and unfortunately she died.
And it went on from there. In the United States, we've only had 2 honorary citizens. One of them was Winston Churchill, and the second was Raoul Wallenberg. Raoul Wallenberg saved the lives of perhaps 100,000 Jews, including 2 members of Congress who were little kids in Hungary from the butcher Eichmann by giving them Swedish passports. He disappeared in 1945 in Budapest when the Soviets conquered Budapest. For years, he was the missing man of history. And Reagan gave a great speech, Where's Wallenberg?, in which he made Wallenberg an honorary citizen of the United States. Well, as the book discloses, Mohnberg was used as a test rat in that poison laboratory to test out new poisons, and slowly and inexorably poisoned to death in 1947 by Stalin in Moscow. There were a whole sequence of Gorky. There were a whole sequence of people. Ramza was a Catholic priest and a bishop and a saint in Ruthenia. Ramza has an accident, obviously staged. The nuns are nursing Ramza to health. All of a sudden, two people arrive from Moscow and they say, we've been sent to take care of Ramza. They give him a shot and Ramza dies. Later, in 1955, in a trial, they admit that they poisoned Ramza. They poisoned him with curare to cause his heart to stop. He's now a saint of the Ruthenian Church, Ruthenian Catholic Church. And there are a whole sequence of people. We actually put, there are so many people, you could write a 3,000-page encyclopedia of individual murders, but we captured a few of them to actually show what was happening. Later, the individual poisonings matured into huge bioweapons labs, the biggest of which was at a place called Saratov in the Soviet Union. And there they took diseases like plague and smallpox, and they weaponized those, and anthrax, so that they could be used on a massive scale. In 1939, Stalin summoned in the head of the Saratov program, a guy named Abram Berlin, to go and meet with the leadership and to discuss the poison lab. He arrived at the Hotel Nacional in Moscow, and he began coughing. And so they got a doctor, and the doctor said, my God, Abram, he said, you've got the plague, pneumonic plague. We haven't seen pneumonic plague in over 300 years in Moscow. Everybody that ran into him died because pneumonic plague was inevitably fatal in those days. They closed down the hotel, the big hotel of Moscow, and they said there was a plumbing failure. And they hid the death of the people that died. It was only much later that the knowledge of all this became public.
Can you maybe speak a little bit to the Russian diaspora and maybe why Stalin was so concerned with them and that they were such a threat to him?
They were. It wasn't clear that he would stay in power particularly in the 1920s. He was a terrible economic failure, and he had to use incredible oppression in order to stay in power, and one purge after another purge after another purge. And so he was terrified of the White Russians in Paris who gathered in Paris. And so killing them was a big time importance. Of course, the interesting thing is how the incredible difference those people made in the world in every field. Our helicopters come from a Russian inventor who was an immigrant. Yul Brynner was a Russian immigrant. You can take each field. In ballet, George Balanchine, who started won the Presidential Medal of Freedom and started the New York City Ballet, was an immigrant from Russia. And so they enriched the whole world, and particularly the United States. But Stalin even sent people here to the United States to murder. He murdered a defector called Walter Kravitsky in Washington in 1941. And he almost certainly murdered a ballet gun, Andrea Pavlova, who founded the Chicago City Ballet in the late 1930s.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Before we move on to some other topics, I wonder if you can maybe speak to why some of the people that Stalin killed overseas, he used these bioweapons and maybe more stealthy, but then other people like Trotsky, he made a real scene of killing them. Are we maybe misunderstanding Trotsky, the way he was killed, or was there different purposes Stalin had?
There were different. If I can speak a little bit and take it to Putin right now, in the Soviet Union, there's a type of poison or liquidation called a Litternoi liquidation. A Litternoi liquidation means a deniable murder, in effect, a concealed murder. And it's done in several ways. It can be done through a staged natural death. In other words, all of a sudden you start coughing and they say, oh, poor Stephen had, a respiratory disease, or your heart stops. And they say, coronary problem. Or it can be a staged suicide. A defector from the Soviet Union, from the KGB named Walter Kravitsky said, any fool can murder someone. but it takes a true artist to stage a natural death or a suicide. And Kravitsky himself was suicided in a fake way not long after. And so the purpose of what they're doing depends on, is carefully thought out. For example, in the last 8 weeks, a total of 7 Russian oligarchs have supposedly committed suicide. The last 3 with their entire families. There was one called the Protosenia family in Spain. The guy leaves Russia in opposition to Putin. He's very important in the oil and gas industry of Russia. And in Spain, supposedly, he hangs himself and chops to death his little daughter and his wife. Fortunately, their son isn't there. The son says he called his daughter Princess, and that the family all loved each other. There was no explicable reason. The police in Moscow say it was a suicide murder. And so it's deniable in the sense that you can say, well, it's a suicide murder. On the other hand, there's absolutely no oligarch in the world who knows other than this, that if you defy Putin, you will die. But more important, your little children will die and your wife will die. And so that's how Stalin killed. In the case of Trotsky, it was difficult to get to Trotsky. And so, of course, he had an anonymous assassin poke him in the eye with an ice pick in order to kill Trotsky in Mexico City. And I suppose he could have tried to use bioweapons, but that was simply the method of killing. And the actual identity of who the assassin was remained unknown for almost 30 years.
Maybe we can change gears to bioweapons, because, I mean, if we go back into history, there's always been some idea of bioweapons. When the Mongols threw dead bodies into the cities, so people had some idea of how these things work. But then when we move into the 20th century, that's where things really get interesting, because people understand more how biology works and how disease works. What was the history of bioweapons?
Well, there were crude bioweapons, just as you said, for a long period of time. Cloths with smallpox on them would be thrown in somewhere and the like. The first really large systematic production of bioweapons in the world occurred in the Soviet Union under Stalin, beginning roughly 1928, 29, 30 at Saratov. And we're talking really big project. By the 1970s, 1972, the Soviet Union embarked on what's called Project Enzyme. There's a book called Biohazards by the defecting number 2 guy in the program who tells us all about it. His name is Kenneth Albeck. And they were spending more money on bioweapons in the 1970s than they were spending on nuclear weapons. They had 36,000 scientists working just on bioweapons in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 1980s. In the Gorbachev period, they abandoned bioweapons, as they did under Yeltsin, and then they adopted them again and went full scale ahead in the Putin period. Putin in 2012 was criticized in a presidential debate over the Red Army's preparedness. And he said to his opponent, yes, but you don't know about our genetic weapons, and that's why you're criticizing it. So he's put immense resources into bioweapons in the Soviet Union. So have the Chinese. The Chinese have 14 huge facilities in China outlined in our book and identified a long time ago, not as bio labs. A biolab is the same place you and I, our blood would go, and there's nothing wrong with a biolab. These are bioweapons labs. Their job is to actually weaponize viruses and bacteria. And these are on a massive, huge scale. They're whole units. The Soviet army today, the Russian army today, spends 1 out of every 5 days practicing for biowar. That's exactly what they do.
In full hazmat suits.
Well, we don't have any bioweapons. The Ukrainians don't have any bioweapons. The only ones that have bioweapons are the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans. So why do you spend a lot of time working on bioweapons? Only because you intend to use them if you need to.
What were some of the early iterations of bioweapons? What was sort of the goal of the bioweapons in the early days of the Soviets?
There are 2 types of bioweapons fundamentally, or maybe I can divide them into 3 types. First are lethal bioweapons, things like smallpox that kill and so on. The second are debilitating bioweapons like COVID-19 that incapacitate. And the third are bioweapons that are designed to wipe out crops and livestock, things like African swine virus and various plant diseases. The problem, of course, with a bioweapon is you don't want your own guys to get sick and to die. And so you have to design a bioweapon where vaccines on your side or genetic editing can actually protect your own people from getting ill. Otherwise, it's like a poison gas that blows both ways. And so vaccine development is typically how bioweapons escape. Our book goes into a 1977 virus that went all over the world, a flu virus from China that escaped during vaccine testing. The Chinese didn't mean for it to escape, but they were developing vaccines against a bioweapon that they had in their labs, and it just got out. It killed more than a million people. And that, of course, is what we think happened with COVID-19. We think COVID-19 was under development as a bioweapon, and that they were developing vaccines for COVID-19 and in Wuhan, and then it got out. And they didn't mean for it to get out, but it did. And it killed, of course, 15 million people so far.
That's really the whole idea of these bioweapons, is that hopefully they can prepare that they have some sort of vaccine and it kills the enemy, but it doesn't kill them. But that sure seems like you're playing with fire. I mean, almost worse than a nuclear weapon.
Well, the great advantage over nuclear weapons, they call them special weapons in China, and Putin calls them special weapons. The great advantage is if Russia fires a nuclear weapon and wipes out London, there are going to be nuclear weapons coming immediately back to wipe out Moscow. They're not deniable. The great advantage of a special weapon is that they can be deniable. Somebody can cough in Kansas, and you go, gee, that's really a shame that you guys didn't get smallpox vaccine, which we've had for a while in Russia. I wonder how that happened. And so they're deniable weapons. Horrifically, Russia's involved in actually genetically editing weapons, viruses, so that they'll attack certain kinds of people and not other kinds of people. So if they'll kill Sarah, it's called the Hunter Project. They'll kill Sarah and not kill me. They'll kill someone who's Irish, but not somebody who's Scandinavian, using genetic predilections. And so using the CRISPR tool, which allows for the very first time the editing of viruses, you're actually watching, terrible things occur, which is a big chunk of why we wrote the book. We really wrote the book, I think, for three reasons. First was just to commemorate, so that they wouldn't be forgotten, some of these wonderful people that Stalin killed and that were killed by Putin, people like Pavlova, so that the effort to try and wipe them out deniably and have them disappear wouldn't work. The second reason we wrote the book was to warn people about Putin and Xi, that these are two really evil people, and that they promise, just like Tojo and Hitler, they promise great evil to the world if we're not prepared. And third, to warn people about these bioweapons in whose ever hands pose a terrible threat to humanity, equally terrible with nuclear weapons, but unknown to most people.
Not to get too much into the scientific technical weeds, what is CRISPR and what are some of the technicalities that they're doing to these viruses that are beyond what a natural virus might do?
CRISPR allows you to actually edit viruses and edit genes, and so it can be used for great purposes. And I'm no expert on all the uses of CRISPR, but CRISPR is in wide use by pharmaceutical companies all over the world. For the very first time, you can alter genes. Some uses of it are very controversial. For example, CRISPR was being used in laboratories in what was called gene enhancement. Now, if I'm in a laboratory and I have a virus I'm trying to work with, it would be really great if I could make that virus communicable instantly in the entire mouse population, so that all the mice got it at the same time. If I could enhance the virus for experimental purposes. The problem with that is if it ever gets out, you've got a real problem. And so the United States in 2015 banned enhancement using CRISPR in any experiments in the United States. It continued to be used in China. Sadly, it appears it continued and did continue to be used in China. So CRISPR is like it reminds me a lot of the Greek myth of the deal where all the good things escape and the hope is the only thing that's captured in it. It's a great tool for good and for evil in the world. It can promise, the cure of any kind of large number of diseases, even the prevention of diseases at an early stage in people. On the other hand, it can produce some of the great horrors of mankind. It's simply a tool that people can use for good or for evil.
The U.S. had some funding and some involvement in the Wuhan lab. Do we know to what degree there was of an involvement with the U.S. in that lab?
Well, initially the original Wuhan, there are two Wuhan labs. One is the Wuhan lab you know about, and the other one is the military lab in Wuhan that's located 2 miles away. The Wuhan lab was originally set up with French funding. The French withdrew from funding it a long time ago. The United States and Australia took over much of the funding of the Wuhan lab. In 2015, the United States withdrew from funding the Wuhan lab, supposedly, but it turns out that kind of surreptitiously, we continued to fund it through third-party grants to a U.S. company that continued doing experiments right in Wuhan. Those experiments supposedly were not involved in any way in the development of the virus that became the COVID-19 virus. The COVID-19 virus is 96.2% from a bat in the Himalayan mountains found in a cave, some 1,100 miles from Wuhan. We know it was brought to the Wuhan lab because there were articles that said it was brought to the Wuhan lab in 2015. Now, 3.8% of it, it's not in the bat. It was added to the bat virus. And the question, of course, is how and what did it do? Because, look, we're dealing with a virus not of natural origin. That's why the deal has been able to mutate so quickly, why we've had such problems vaccinating against it, and why it's been so unpredictable. In any event, there's no evidence that I know of that we were involved in the enhancement of the COVID-19 virus. And of course, I pray that we weren't. It is also true that we were involved in obfuscating to some degree what was actually happening in Wuhan. If you look at the emails in 2019, at NIH, they said, boy, this looks like to us, it was a created virus. And then they say, well, we can't say that. People will hold that against science and so on. And aren't we worried about the funding that went indirectly to Wuhan? The United States government, 6 months before, after inspecting the Wuhan lab, 6 months before the virus actually got out, said this is a bombshell waiting to happen here. This deal can leak at any time. And we cite that in the book.
I wonder, to start to wrap up, what do you two think that we can do, the U.S., the governments around the world can do to try and stop some of this and stop all the bioweapons that are so deniable in so many ways? What is any way we can protect ourselves from this?
It may sound stupid, but an old saying is sunlight is the greatest purgative. And the very first step is to have people know about it. The very first step is to quit all the lying, the obfuscation, the hiding, and the pretending, and just tell the truth. The truth is that COVID-19 virus came from the Wuhan laboratory, probably the Wuhan military laboratory in China. It is a created virus. It is not a natural virus. It wasn't somebody chomping down on an unknown bat. It's never been found in nature. 3 years, we conducted an Easter egg hunt for an Easter egg that doesn't exist because it got created. So once we realized that we've lost 15 million people to a created virus from a biolab, and we shine the light of the world on all that, that's step number one. The tyrants all live in the shadow. Stalin had to kill Pavlova secretly because if the world knew that he had killed Pavlova, there would have been widespread hatred all over the world. If people knew that the Chinese Communist government had created the COVID-19 virus and then hidden it, their program would be gone overnight. Likewise with Putin's poison program. So step number one is learning about it. Step number two is actually condemning it. We have a treaty, the 1972 BWC treaty, which bans the production of bioweapons. It's just not followed. those three countries have banned all inspections, and they're not following it. So step number one is to learn all about it. And step number two is then to take action to wipe it out. It's easy to wipe it out. We've begun putting sanctions on the companies in Russia, at least, that are involved in bioweapons production at Saratov. But we've taken only minor steps compared to what we need to do.